Perennial vegetables often yield little or nothing. Swap your Roscoff onion for a walking onion or your blue Soul's leek for a wild leek, and I guarantee you'll be disappointed. It's the same for cabbages, it's the same for broccoli, it's the same for beans. If you want tomatoes, cucumbers or zucchinis, there are no perennial vegetables like those. Some, like artichokes or rhubarb, do produce, but we already know about them. We added the perennial vegetables label to boost marketability. If we aren't aware of some perennial vegetables, it's likely because they don't yield or aren't desirable. So perennial vegetables suck. Here's a new episode of Truk Null, and I'll explain why I waited to do this one. So a big thank you to you, Black Olson, for your very interesting comment, which makes me want to respond and which says out loud what some people are only thinking. Today we're going to talk about all the misconceptions surrounding perennial vegetables, because there are quite a few, and above all we'll look at the best ways to incorporate them into the garden and how to use them. I hope by the end of the video some of you will find them less lame, except maybe you, Black Olson, since you really don't like them. It's true that some perennial vegetables may not taste as good or produce as well. If the idea is to group all perennial vegetables except the interesting ones just to criticize them, that's not okay. So I'm making a video about it. On the other hand, comments mention things like artichokes and rhubarb, which we already knew. We just labeled them as perennial vegetables. Basically, you mean that we're taking advantage of a marketing angle, riding a trend to make it more appealing. Well, I'll strengthen your point. You mentioned artichokes and rhubarb, we know those. But yes, we also know sweet potatoes. And even more, we know potatoes. Everyone grows potatoes. Well, here too, I add the label perennial vegetables. But that's not something new. Potatoes are a perennial vegetable. Actually, maybe there's something that's not really clear about what exactly a perennial vegetable is. It's such a broad term, there are a lot of things included. A perennial vegetable, or a perennial plant in general, isn't an annual plant that you have to reseed every year. These plants live more than a year, survive winter, and don't need reseeding each spring. Artichokes and rhubarb, for example, stay in the ground and regrow on their own. And for other plants, like all those that produce tubers, you still have to dig them up once a year to eat the tubers, and then you'll keep some of those tubers to replant them. So just because you have to harvest them every year and replant them doesn't mean they're not perennial vegetables. The real difference is about sowing seeds versus replanting a tuber. So it's not a new category that we've just invented. These are vegetables we've known and cultivated forever. So it's not just because it's a new trend for me. My nursery specializes in perennial vegetables because I'm convinced there's real value in making that distinction in our minds, at least to separate plants into different categories, especially into annual plants and perennial plants. And for perennial plants, perennial vegetables, it's really much easier to get harvest compared to plants that have to be grown from seed. I often enjoy a little game, and now I'll play it with you behind the camera. How many times have you started seeds of any kind of plant, and how many times have you failed with your seedlings? And by comparison, how many times have you planted a tuber like a potato or anything else? And how many times have you failed planting a tuber? In general, we failed a lot with seedlings. We don't even know how many times, but with tubers, you just don't fail. So for me, perennial vegetables really make it much easier to grow things. So to conclude this first part, we have certain perennial vegetables like sweet potatoes, or in other countries, taro and yams, which are extremely productive, very tasty, and are even a staple food for humanity. So saying that perennial vegetables aren't good and don't produce, well, that's not true. But I do agree that perennial vegetables don't replace everything. If you want tomatoes, cucumbers, squash or zucchini, there are no perennial vegetables like those. Remember, the goal was never to replace all our vegetables with perennials or to stop growing annual gardens, but rather to include perennial vegetables as an option. No, perennial vegetables are meant to enhance the garden, but we don't skip tomatoes or zucchini. I wouldn't go a year without tomatoes. Well, with perennial vegetables, we do have things like tree tomatoes, pepino, tomatillo, not necessarily perennial in our climate, but still, these plants will never replace a tomato. They don't even taste like tomatoes. So basically, perennial vegetables are a huge category of plants. There are lots of plants in there, but perennial vegetables will never replace all our annual vegetables. That's not the idea. All right, now about productivity. As I mentioned in the introduction, things like walking onions, vine leeks, perennial cabbages, perennial beans, they're not as productive as their annual versions in a traditional vegetable garden. Well, obviously, I'll tell you, it depends. It always depends. It depends, it varies. But I think that comparing the productivity of the perennial version to the annual version isn't really the right way to look at it, and we'll look at some concrete examples to understand this a bit better. Let's start with beans. We have the Presser's toe bean, which is a perennial bean that produces huge seeds, and if the climate suits it, it will regrow from its roots every year. Well, on the other hand, it's true that this bean isn't necessarily as productive as other beans, or at least not in the first year. If you prefer green beans, choose them. Perennial beans are clearly less appealing. But on the other hand, you can look at it differently. That is, you'll plant your usual vegetable garden, sow your green beans or pole beans, whatever you want. And then next to that, you have borders, you have bushes, you have fruit trees. And in those areas, there might be a small space to plant a perennial bean that will come back every year, almost without you having to do anything. There might be a little weeding to do from time to time, once or twice a year, to make sure your bean grows back well. But other than that, you have nothing else to do except go and harvest. That will just be a bonus compared to beans grown the usual way. The perennial variety won't replace the annual one. It will just be some extra production without having to do anything or almost anything extra. Same thing for cabbages in the vegetable garden. You will keep growing your Kabu cabbages, your Savoy cabbages, those big head cabbages that make large heads. And once they're harvested, well, that's it. You get them yearly if you can grow them. You also have perennial cabbages like this one that keep growing year-round in orchards and bushes. There are areas where these cabbages grow continuously. When you want cabbage and there are no Kabu cabbages or you missed sowing, you can pick these leaves almost year-round and cook them however you like. It's always available. And again, almost without having to do anything, it's the same for onions and leeks. On one hand, you'll have your classic crops that you grow from bulbs. We're still talking about perennials. Or from seeds if you can get them to grow, but that's not always easy. But on the other hand, you have your perennial leeks, onions and garlic, which are either in orchards, in bushes, or in areas in beds really dedicated to that. And in those areas, you'll have smaller yields, but they'll be regular and they'll be guaranteed stable all year round. And this is probably the most important part. We're not using space meant for annuals, and we have separate areas for perennials. And these aren't necessarily areas dedicated only to perennial vegetables, but to perennial plants in general, flower beds, bushes, fruit trees, and it's in these areas that we'll integrate the perennial vegetables. Once established, they may not give the biggest yields, but at least they're reliable. There's also another way to grow perennial vegetables, which I find very interesting. We'll use this technique for the perennial leek, which is more interesting and larger than the vineyard leek. For garlic and the things that we're going to grow like leeks, because botanically it's still a leek, and in terms of size it's as big as a regular leek. We're also planning this with the potato onion, another perennial onion that grows larger bulbs than the rocambole onion. And because with perennial vegetables, just like with annual gardens, for each vegetable there will be several different varieties, and while we're at it, we'll choose the ones that are the most interesting and the most productive. So the technique, as I was saying, will be to have dedicated areas like for the rocambole onion and the potato onion. They will multiply, replant themselves, and form dense clumps where they will be very dense. And when it's dense, of course, they're not very big, but it's a reserve. Sometimes you'll visit the reserve where they're crowded and small. You'll take them out, separate them, and plant them in a regular vegetable garden. So that means an area that has been loosened, enriched with compost. You plant them just like you would plant store-bought bulbs, well separated from each other, well spaced apart. And at the end of the growing season, you'll have bulbs, you'll have leeks with stalks that are much bigger than when they were growing crowded together, and then you'll harvest them to eat them like that. If you leave them whole, they will divide again and become small again. But by doing a cycle like you would for an annual plant, you can get some pretty interesting yields. So here, in this case, it's grown like annual plants, except you don't need to go through sowing, you don't need to buy small bulbs, you just have your bushes where they grow on top of each other, and it's a guaranteed supply of planting stock to then grow them annually and get interesting yields. That's self-sufficiency, and it's very productive. So now, another advantage of perennial vegetables is the discovery of lots of new things, new varieties, new types of plants that you don't find at all in annual gardens. Like Japanese artichoke, oca from Peru, tuberous wisteria, goat yam, Chinese yam, earth pear, or some forgotten ancient vegetables like Jerusalem artichoke or chervil. So these are discoveries that can be interesting both in terms of how to grow them, and in cooking is not always successful in certain climates, in certain contexts, soil types or so on. Some will grow better than others, so make your choices based on what already works for you. Some plants grow so well, like Jerusalem artichoke, that they could become invasive, so be careful, but there are still plenty of ways to manage and use them, so it can still be interesting. And when it comes to taste, well, it's very broad. Some will be discussed later in the video and can be harder to digest, mainly because we're not used to eating them. We'll cover this more from a culinary perspective. First, about growing them, as I was saying, some like Jerusalem artichokes can be invasive, so we set aside a specific area for them. It could be bushes, it could be hedges along the edge. Some people have told me in the comments, yes, it depends on the size of the garden you have. If you have a very small garden and only have space for annual vegetable beds, well, sorry, yes, then it's simply not an option. But if you have a bit of space and some wild areas, add some perennial vegetables like Jerusalem artichokes, like liantes, like climbing plants, like tuberous wisteria, and then just let them grow on their own. And again, once it's set up, there's nothing more to do than throughout the winter, whenever you want, just go harvest a little so you can eat some or add it to the rest of your meals. So that's for the plants that can be a bit imposing, like Jerusalem artichokes and similar ones. Then for others that are a bit less imposing, like, well, we have dwarf Jerusalem artichokes, black Jerusalem artichokes, we have oca from Peru, Japanese groundnuts. These are plants that will, let's say, not grow taller than 30, 40 or 50 centimeters, and they can easily be integrated among classic vegetable garden plants. Since these are crops that we'll have to pull up, for the tubers at least, these are crops that we'll have to dig up at the end of the year, so we can definitely integrate perennial vegetables among annual vegetables. And actually for me, it's often the opposite. I have my perennial vegetable crops, my rows of perennial vegetables, but in between I add lettuces, I add radishes, I mix my crops. Well, it's not complicated to add them to the other crops. And then the part that can be a bit scary is the invasive side. Many of you are worried that after growing Jerusalem artichokes, a small tuber might stay underground that we didn't see and will grow back the next year. When it gets to 20, 30 or 40 centimeters tall, you just grab it, pull it out, take the tuber with it, and that's it, it won't grow back. So for a vegetable garden area that you cultivate in the usual way, where you go there regularly, it's not hard to manage. On the other hand, in areas where you don't go often, yes, it can definitely become invasive. But if it's in places where it doesn't matter, personally, I don't see the problem. So depending on the crops, for some plants that aren't very big, like OCA or Crohn's, well, it happens to me every year, yes, to see some coming back. This year we have Peruvian OCA coming back in the middle of regular onion crops. Actually, it's not a problem. It makes a nice ground cover. And besides that, I have places where Jerusalem artichokes are coming back everywhere. And well, it's not hard to pull on the Jerusalem artichoke stem, the tuber comes with it, and that clears an area where it won't grow back once the tuber is pulled out. So it's not, I mean, you shouldn't be afraid of these crops. They're not that troublesome, not that invasive, not that hard to manage. Where it might be hard to manage, but where you don't need to manage it, is if it's planted in wild areas that you don't visit, that you don't see often, that you don't work on often. Yes, it can become invasive, but in the garden areas where you're regularly present, where you're there every day, it's not that hard to manage. And then being overrun by an edible plant, honestly, maybe it's not that big of a deal. Another group of interesting perennial vegetables are climbers, such as American groundnut and Chinese yam. These are crops, especially if you have supports. I have pergolas all over the garden with trellises to let them climb, so it's easy to add a few tubers of climbing plants. While growing other crops there, you can also grow salad greens, radishes, tomatoes, or anything you like. The climbing plants will grow above the annual vegetables underneath, and they won't compete with each other. Plus, the climbing plants will even provide a bit of shade for the vegetables, which most of the time is actually pretty good in the middle of summer. Well, and now, if you still think it's complicated to set up, that it doesn't produce much and that it takes a lot of work, go see people who grow them and ask them, and I think they'll tell you the same thing as I do. So now, regarding the food aspect, well, first of all, in terms of taste, for me, most, if not all, of the tubers are excellent when it comes to flavor. So I'd really like to know, Black Olson, who left me the comment, I'd really like to know which perennial vegetables you've tasted to say that they have no flavor, because from my point of view, at least these are things that are really good to eat. The downside, the thing that most people complain about with these vegetables, with these tubers, is more about digestion. Jerusalem artichokes and yacons do that. If you're not used to eating them, it can cause some minor discomfort, gas, diarrhea, things like that. Okay, that's not great. 2 tips on how to eat them. And first, do your research. I'm not going to do it for every tuber, but I'm not going to give you a rundown for every vegetable. Do your research. For each tuber, there will be little tips you can find on the internet, in books here and there. Like with Jerusalem artichoke, they'll tell you to cook it with baking soda in the water or in several changes of water, to boil it once, pour off the water, then cook it again to get rid of what might cause discomfort. Then for Jerusalem artichokes, it's recommended to eat them while they're still fresh. After harvesting, eat them quickly. On the other hand, for yacon or ground pear, it's recommended to let the tubers mature a little after harvesting so that they taste better and are also easier to digest. So there you go, do your research, because for each tuber there will be little tips. And the second tip, and probably the most important one, is if you're not used to it or if you've never eaten it before, be careful the first time you try it. And so, well, sorry Carol for always telling your story, but Carol is with me. She had never eaten Jerusalem artichoke before, and the first time she wanted to try it with her kids, she made a Jerusalem artichoke gratin with only Jerusalem artichoke. Well, she had a rough night. I'm not going to go into more details, but there you go. Take it easy. If you've never eaten these vegetables before, well, you're going to make a potato gratin or whatever you usually eat, and you're going to add a little bit of them, and you'll see how it goes. And you won't necessarily eat them the next day. You'll wait 2 or 3 days, and then you'll try again. If it went well, you'll add a little more. And you'll allow your microbiota and all the bacteria in your intestines, you'll allow them to adapt and evolve according to your diet. But if you need to change something in your diet, and this applies to everything, do it gradually, see how it goes, and give your stomach time to adapt. There you go. And normally, or at least I hope so for you, it should go well. Alright, I've reached the end. I hope I've managed to change some minds, or at least help some people see perennial vegetables differently. And well, let me know in the comments what you think. Which perennial vegetables do you eat, and which are your favorites? Share any cooking tips you have. It could be interesting. Everyone else, check out the comments too. Alright, thanks for watching until the end. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up, share the video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. All that good stuff. It always makes me happy. It makes me happy. If you'd like to support me financially, you can use Typee. I'll put the link in the top right, the video description, and at the end, so you'll find it. And a big thank you to everyone who supports me, because without you, I wouldn't be able to take the time to make all these videos. Alright, thanks everyone. See you soon for more videos. Bye. Salut.